Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I am Trevor Scott here with my co-host Matt Duraldi,
What's going on, guys?
and we will be continuing our 32 team breakdown from a fantasy perspective. So we're going to get into the AFC South here this week, and we're going to start up top on Tuesday with the Texans.
Houston Texans. They kind of
Excited to
came
talk
out of
about this one.
nowhere.
This is going to
Yeah,
be great.
really
Yeah.
excited to talk about. Dude, they kind of became America's team last year a little bit. Move over Cowboys in the state of Texas. Like they they struck
Cowboy fans
gold.
jumping ship onto the team that's actually good.
I wouldn't even be surprised, honestly. But I digress. Yeah, man, they finished 10-7. They made the playoffs. They destroyed the Cleveland Browns. I know we kind of ripped on Cleveland a little bit for that game in the Browns episode. So if you haven't seen that, go ahead and check it out. But yeah, I mean, they drafted CJ Stroud, who was my number one QB going into last year. I know that wasn't the popular opinion, but I'm sure everyone will tell you that now. And then, obviously on the defensive side of the ball, they traded up to get Will Anderson into the early part of the first round. Actually, they traded up to three,
To
right?
three.
Didn't they pick
Yep.
2 and
They
3
traded from
last year?
12 to 3. Yeah.
Yeah, and they just hit a gold mine. I mean, I'm really excited to see how this team, progresses. Some big moves in the offseason. Obviously they had a pretty big vacant spot at the cornerback position. They brought in CJ Henderson, Jeff Okudah, two previous top 10 guys that haven't really worked out for their respective teams. So they're kind of taking a little bit of a lotto ticket on those guys. So we'll see how that pans out. They traded for Stephon Diggs, who we'll obviously
Huge.
dive into with the fantasy perspective. Signed Joe Mixon, who, you and I don't really care for, but I think he'll kind of help the offense keep moving.
Good addition.
And then in the draft, it was kind of a weird draft. I don't know. I didn't really like this draft. I mean, they traded out of the first round pretty early on with Minnesota. So if you guys remember, with all the speculation that Minnesota was going to use picks 11 and 23 to move up and get a quarterback, that's who they traded the 23rd pick for. And, when I look at that and I look at corner as the biggest position of need, given, the top tier of cornerback prospects in this draft class, it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So they traded back to number 42. They took cornerback Kamari Lassiter, who a lot of people had as like a third round grade on him, not a super high profile athlete. But I don't know. I mean, they could have had Terry and Arnold at number 23, and the thought of having him opposite Derek Stingley on a young team would have excited me a lot more. It had another late second round pick, took an offensive tackle from Notre Dame, kind of a projection, kind of a bench player for now. But, a lot of people think that he could have been a first round pick had he stayed in college one more year. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to question, what Houston is doing in the draft, but, let's not pretend that they're like the Niners or the Ravens, that everything they touch turns to gold. So this will be an interesting one to look back on, but overall the roster's in really good shape. So let's not lose sight of the fact that, this team's in a really good position. And maybe I'll throw it to you from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, and they obviously have the elite quarterback on a rookie contract going for them right now. I mean, they went out and spent a bunch of money in free agency, went and traded for Diggs and signed the cornerbacks to fix their back end of their defense, and then signed Mixon to fix their backfield. So they have, although the draft could have been better, obviously that first round pick, they weren't expecting to be able to get a corner like that there. So I bet you that they are kicking themselves for making that trade so early in the offseason, but they do get an extra second round pick next year out of it. So I think it's all going to work out for them. From a fantasy perspective, let's just start up top with Stroud, since we already talking about him quite a bit. He was QB 11 last year, and obviously some of that's getting his footing. And then, Tank Dell dealing with an injury was very unfortunate for his overall stock, right? Because it was very clear very early that Tank Dell was kind of his go-to guy in crunch time. So when he needed a play, he was going to Tank Dell. And so, losing that is going to obviously create a hole in the offense that could have possibly continued to elevate him above 11. He's going at QB5 right now. I think that might even be a little low. I think, he should be looked at definitely as a top 5 for sure. And I think, we've talked about Lamar in this series already, how he kind of is a little inconsistent and sometimes isn't needed to win games and stuff like that. So, there's and Mahomes, his weapons are kind of in flux. It's 2 new players, and Rashee Rice dealing with the suspension. So, I think there's a potential here for him to even get pushed up higher than 5. And I think it would be justified. And I think especially bringing in Diggs, getting Tank Dell back from injury and helping fix their run game a little bit with Mixon kind of sets him up in a very good position. I think he's in a very good spot to succeed. He's going to have big time playmakers all around him. They have Tank in the slot, obviously Nico outside and Diggs outside. So I don't know exactly how the breakdown in targets is going to be between those 3 players. So we'll get into that in a minute. But with Stroud, he's going to be benefiting in a big way from all of these players around him. And we still have, they still have Dalton Schultz in place there as well. So, they have what feels like good players at all of the skill positions in terms of pass catching. And I think that's going to help elevate him into even a further tier than he was last year. So I'm very excited about Stroud. I currently have him at 5, but I really want to move him up to 3 amongst quarterbacks. And in a super flex league, I think he's going in the first round. I expect him to go in the first round of our league, maybe early second. But even in a standard league, we could see him getting picked in the middle rounds there, somewhere in round 5, round 6, something like that.
Yeah, I love Stroud, man, and I'm afraid that I'm just afraid I'm not going to have him on a lot of teams just because I currently have Anthony Richardson a spot higher than them, and if consensus is Stroud, then I'm probably not gonna get him. But I love him as a playmaker. I loved watching him at Ohio State. Like, again, I'll beat this to death that he should have been, the number 1 over Bryce Young, but whatever. But I guess kind of piggybacking off of all of his weapons, like, how are you viewing these 3 wide receivers going into the year? Because in my opinion, I feel like I'm going to end up with the most Tank Dell because he's ranked the lowest. He's got the connection. He's the youngest. He's also CJ Stroud's like best friend. I don't know. It's just tough for me to take Nico or Diggs when I don't know. I go back and forth. What do you think?
Yeah, I think too with Tank Dell, the other reason why you like him a lot is I know with the the CJ Stroud and Micah Parsons discussion when they were talking about like their overall best teams, Stroud put Tank in his slot. He could have picked anybody, any slot receiver in the league, and he picked Tank Dell. So, I mean, there's obviously a connection beyond just the football field there for them. They've played together forever. They know exactly what each other is going to do. And so,
and
there
is an element. Go draft this guy when Houston was on, like, he talked to the owner and said, go get Tank Dell in the draft.
Yeah. And they drafted him in the 3rd round. Some people thought that was an overdraft, but obviously not anymore. So, just a little bit of added context to why Tank Dell is still a very good pick, even though he's going 31st and is likely going to be the 3rd option, but he could be the 2nd option. And I think that there's going to be quite a bit of target disparity. It's going to be one of those situations where it's hard to know on a week-to-week basis who to play. I think, it's one of those situations where, Diggs could pop off for 10 targets, 8 catches, 100 yards and a touchdown. And then the other 2 don't do anything. And the following week, Diggs has 4 for 30. And you have Nico, who has 11 targets, 9 catches, 125 and a touchdown. So, like, that's kind of how I see this playing out. But my hope and how I'm kind of going to draft these guys is that Diggs is going to be the number 1. And that's not currently how it's being drafted. Nico is currently going ahead of Diggs in ADP. And I know Nico was very good at the end of last year, but it was because he was the only game in town. He did really well in the playoffs. Once Tank Dell went down at the very end of the year, right, he was racking up these ridiculously big totals. And I get that he's talented and everything. And I get that he carried the offense last year, but I think we're going to see something very different. And I don't expect him to be a target hog in the same way. And I think that's going to be Diggs's role within this offense. I think that's why they went out and got him. Nico, not relegated, but Nico is going to play more of the deep threat, a little bit less target share over the middle, less slants, less quick hitters to him. And Tank is going to be navigating the short area, and he's going to be navigating over the middle. And obviously, that's not to say that they can't change or transition positions, but that's my expectation of how the offense is going to be set up. So in that case, and how they're being drafted for fantasy, I'm going to end up with the most Diggs of the group, unless people are drafting Diggs aggressively, draft and in the leagues I'm in, he ends up getting picked around wide receiver 15. I'm just going to end up with more Diggs than anybody else. And seeing Diggs at 21 just doesn't feel right after having seen him up in the top 6 at least the last 2 years, 3 years. And he's going to a more crowded wide receiver room, but he's going to a better situation overall offensively. So, I know Diggs at the end of last year fell off, and it was 2 years in a row where he had kind of tapered off towards the end of the year. But I think that kind of happens when your offense is so centric on one player, and he's playing up in Buffalo, where it gets harder to throw as you get later in the year. And his home games aren't going to be outside in frigid temperatures in December and January. They're going to be in Texas, right? And so I just think that there's a lot of things that factored into Diggs tailing off. And my favorite one to draft of this group is Diggs.
Interesting. So I didn't know that you were going to go in that direction, but I mean, if you're listening to this and you believe that Diggs is going to be Stroud's number one target, then like by all means, like attack that. I guess maybe having Diggs on my team last year kind of soured my taste, and starting him every week, like I just couldn't manage to take him out of my lineup. Yeah. And yeah, so I'm probably going to be out on him, but yeah, I mean, like you said, if that's who you think is going to be the number one, then you're going to have them all over the place, because then 21 is a steal.
Yeah, and we in the mock draft we talked about roster construction, right? And both of us like to go receiver heavy up top, but if it doesn't work out that way, or you end up where you're in the 5th round, which is kind of where I could see Diggs going, and you don't have that third receiver yet, I think that could be a very good spot to kind of take him. And like I said, there's going to be some volatility, because this offense can't just run through one player. You got 5 skill position players who all can catch the ball. So it's not going to be just set, forget, expect big results here. And that's why he's getting pushed down, because of how crowded the offense is. But overall, I think that the weekly upside is going to justify having him in your lineup all the time. And I think the overall offense can keep him viable even in his down weeks. If you have to deal with some 4 for 40s or 5 for 50s, that's not the end of the world, right? Everybody kind of goes through that. So,
Sure.
So, I really like Diggs. Obviously really like all these guys too. I'm just not going to be picking Nico Collins when I can wait around and take Diggs. That's kind of my thought on that. And I wouldn't mind also, like, people are going to be asking about this in terms of the receivers. I personally wouldn't mind getting 2 out of these guys either. Like, if I can get Diggs in the 5th and Tank in the 7th, I would not shy away from that at all. I think that's something that you have a good offense, you have good players, and you can get multiple guys from the same offense. I don't have a problem necessarily doing that in this case, because of how good I think Stroud is going to be and how good I think this offense is going to play.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's really popular in like a best ball format. But yeah, I mean, if one of those guys ends up being the clear cut number one, and that would be a great situation. Do we have to talk about my least favorite player, Joe Mixon?
Maybe we do.
Okay, go ahead.
So Mixon, we battle with one of our buddies, Tom's, all the time on Mixon, who just thinks he's the greatest player. He did finish as running back 5 last year, so he does have volume upside, and he does have touchdown upside in this offense. So there is a place for him. He's currently going as running back 14. Last year, we came into the year thinking that the player to own was going to be Dameon Pierce, and he just completely disappeared. He wasn't even ownable, actually. So I guess at least there was that. At least you could cut him. And Devin Singletary came in, and he played well. He was definitely a acceptable starter at the end of the year. He was getting a lot of volume, had a couple games where he went over 100 yards. Did decent in the passing game. And I think Mixon will do well in the passing game this year too. It's tough when he's likely going to be either the fourth or the fifth option in the passing game. So the target volume on a week-to-week basis isn't necessarily going to be crazy available. So I think his rushing totals are going to have to match, what you would expect from somebody that's going to go as an RB2. And I'm just not sure that that's going to be any sort of consistent week-to-week production. If he's only getting 15 carries and 2 targets, or 3 targets on a weekly average, that's not going to be somebody that's going to finish as an RB2, I don't think. If he exceeds that, if he is much more involved in the passing game than I'm expecting, maybe then, but I just don't see the passing game work be any sort of consistent on any sort of consistent basis. So I don't think he's going to be scoring touchdowns. I don't think his volume's going to be there from a passing game perspective like it was in Cincinnati last year. And then he also racked up so much of his production last year in Cincinnati after Burrow went down, because it was just Browning dumping it down to him constantly. And so I don't know. I struggle with Mixon just because I don't think he's that talented of a player either. Yeah. So he was in this situation for his whole career.
14, it's just way too high for me. And like, this feels like a team that, passes to set up the run, and, Mixon can get a few yards at a time and here and there, but he's not going to break off any 70-yard touchdown runs. I don't really see the upside, and with the other players that are available, like I'm going to be shying away from Mixon. And like you said about our buddy, go ahead and draft him, Hamza, because I don't want him.
Totally, I guess the last pick, I want to ask you about something that just came out recently too. And by the time you're listening to this, it might be irrelevant, but maybe there's been more discussion around it. Is Dameon Pierce in camp? They've been saying, oh, it's great to have Mixon, to be our 1-2 punch for our, with Dameon Pierce. Are you worried about Pierce taking work away at all from Mixon, even if it's, 5, 6, 7 carries a game? Are you worried about that at all?
I mean, yes and no, because we've seen only 2 years ago how dominant Pierce can look at times, and he's, I guess, got that ceiling. And I don't know what happened last year. Like, I kind of went with a 0 RB strategy, and Pierce was someone, I took in a later round and it expected to be a good pick, but I don't know. I mean, I guess a little bit, but like I said, I'm going to be shying away from, the running backs on this team anyway. But yeah, last year was just weird, man, because we saw how good he looked as a rookie at times.
Yeah. Yeah, and it just completely fell off for a second-year player. It's so weird. On that scale, right, where he went from being a very productive player, somebody that you wanted, somebody that was desired in fantasy, to somebody that just is on the waiver wire, not even starting for his team. So we'll see how the backfield plays out. If you want your Joe Mixon fix, or if you want positive reinforcement on getting Joe Mixon, you got to go somewhere else. So sorry if you are a Mixon truther, but we are not, and we will not be.
No.
Regardless of how well he does. So okay, so we covered the quarterback, covered the running backs, covered the receivers now. So we'll get into the tight end.
Dalton Schultz, they've got him at number 14 right now on Fantasy Pros. He finished as tight end 11 last year. I've always liked Dalton Schultz. Like, I had him on my team when he was in Dallas. Like, we've seen his ability to make big plays, but when he's the fourth option on the team, like, I'm going to go in a different direction. And at 14, like, you're probably only drafting him if you're taking a second tight end, or if you're in a 12-team league. But I can't do the number 4 option on the team.
I don't know that he necessarily would be only a second tight end option. There's some tight ends in front of him that other teams might take a second tight end before you even take one if you wait all the way until the end of your draft. And I could see taking Dalton Schultz ahead of a lot of the guys that are going around him. I mean, he's got Brock Bowers in front of him. He's got Dallas Goedert in front of him. He's got Pat Freiermuth right behind him, Cole Kmet right behind him, Hunter Henry behind him. Like, I think he kind of stands out there, in my opinion. I know, like you said, best case scenario, he's going to be the fourth option. But on a team that's going to have such a large pass volume, it's not exactly like the tight end needs to get a ton of targets, right? I mean, he can have games where he has 6 targets, 4 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown, and that's going to be very productive from a tight end perspective. And being on such an efficient offense, I think, is a positive. So, you see David Njoku. We talked about him. Maybe he's a little, you're not exactly comfortable drafting him where you have to take him, and he doesn't have the Joe Flacco factor anymore there. So, maybe you wait a couple rounds and Njoku ends up going, and getting Dalton Schultz, to me, if you can get a decent player in lieu of picking a tight end, in kind of an awkward spot of the draft, or if you aren't necessarily comfortable with Njoku as somebody that you're going to set and forget as your tight end, I could see waiting and ending up picking Dalton Schultz, try and build out the rest of your roster. And then, Schultz is who you start with as your tight end streamer. So I guess I was expecting you to say that you liked Schultz. So I'm a little bit surprised that, you don't, you would think of him as a tight end only because like you mentioned with Bowers though, right, that he's a better tight end 2 target, or TJ Hawkinson, right? I mean, Hawkinson should be getting healthy towards the end of the year. He's a better number 2 target as a tight end, right? But the even you go down and you can get, I guess you're not going to get Taysom Hill. Nobody's drafting Taysom Hill, but you drafted K. Dotton, I think, in our draft, right? That's another guy you could take as a tight end 2 who has upside, but that you don't look as somebody that you can even stream to start the year, right? You're looking for him to do something before you start him. So, I guess I just see Schultz a little bit differently. I think he's a good target as your beginning of the year starter, and then just try and feel out the position from an overall perspective, seeing if anybody gets cut, see if any of the rookies end up working out, and then move forward.
Sure. Cool. All right. Any lasting thoughts on Texans?
Nope. This is a big one. I know we talked for a while on this one, and there are a lot of players. I mean, all of these guys are getting drafted, maybe except for Schultz in 10-team leagues, but it depends on how the league overall sees him, or who ends up taking tight ends. But yeah, this is going to be a fun offense to watch. All 5 of the major guys are going to go very high in the drafts that we see throughout the summer, and rightfully so. I think that this is going to be a really good offense, and that we're in for fantasy fireworks from this team. So very excited about the Texans, and we will be back with you guys tomorrow to review the Colts, who are also a very exciting offense. So we're looking forward to that. Talk to you guys soon.
Can't wait. Later.
See ya.